Montana, 1882. Caleb Morrison had faced a lot of things in his 22 years. He had faced a horse that threw him 3 times before he finally stayed on. He had faced a Montana winter alone in a line shack, with nothing but dried beans and stubbornness. He had faced a cattle stampede at 16 that had left him with a scar on his left forearm, and a story he still told badly. None of it had prepared him for the front porch of the Reed Ranch. He stood at the gate on a Thursday morning in October with his hat in his hands and his heart doing something unreasonable in his chest, looking at the house where Frank Reed was almost certainly inside, and thought about turning around. He had thought about turning around every day for 3 months. Frank Reed was 55 years old, 6 feet, and 2 inches of Montana rancher, with a beard gone gray before its time and eyes, that had the quality of a man who has seen enough to know exactly what he's looking at. The kind of man other men described as fair. What they meant was that he was fair, the way weather is fair, consistently, without sentiment, and entirely without interest in what you thought about it. Caleb was 22 years old. He owned a horse, a saddle, a good knife, and approximately $14. He worked for wages on the Henderson operation 6 miles east, which paid decently for seasonal work, and not at all in winter. He was, by any reasonable measurement, too poor for Frank Reed's daughter. He knew this. He had known it for the entire 3 months. He had been trying not to fall in love with Annie Reed, which had been approximately as successful as trying not to notice the sunrise. He opened the gate. He walked to the porch. He knocked. And when Frank Reed opened the door and looked at him with those eyes, Caleb Morrison said the truest and most terrifying thing he had ever said to another human being. "Mr. Reed, I'd like to speak with you about Annie." It had started, as most things in Caleb's life started, with a fence. Specifically, the fence line between the Henderson property and the Reed property, which had a section that came down every spring when the creek flooded, and which in the spring of 1882 had come down on the Henderson side, which technically made it Henderson's problem, which meant Caleb was the one fixing it. He had been out there for 2 hours on a May morning driving posts into ground that was still soft from the melt when he heard someone on the other side of the fence line. He looked up. Annie Reed was 19 years old, with dark wavy hair that she kept in a loose braid, and the specific directness of a person who grew up knowing exactly where things were and how they worked. She was checking the Reed fence line, the section on her side, which was also down, which meant she was doing her father's fence work on a Saturday morning without being asked, which Caleb noted. "Henderson's side," she said by way of greeting. "Yes," he said. "We're down on our side, too." She looked at the damage with the assessing eye of someone who has repaired fences before. "That post has been soft since last fall," Papa kept saying he'd get to it. "I can do your side, too," Caleb said, "while I'm here." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. He fixed the Henderson side. Then he fixed the Reed side. She brought him water halfway through, which he accepted, and they talked for 20 minutes about the fence and the flood and the Henderson cattle, and whether the spring was coming early or late. And when he rode home that evening, he was already in trouble, and he knew it. He saw her 4 more times before June, always at some distance, always briefly. Each time he rode away, feeling like a man who had been standing too close to a fire and had not moved away when he should have. By July, he had stopped pretending this was going to resolve itself without his involvement. Ruth Reed had been married to Frank for 28 years and had developed in that time the specific skill of seeing things her husband was going to need 3 weeks to arrive at on his own. She saw Caleb Morrison the first time he came to the Reed property, not to speak to Frank, not yet. Just passing through on an errand for Henderson that happened to bring him within conversation distance of the front porch where Annie was shelling peas. Ruth watched from the kitchen window. She watched him take his hat off when he spoke to Annie. She watched him listen when Annie spoke. Actually, listen, not wait. She watched him laugh at something, Annie said with a genuine laugh of a person who has been surprised into it. She watched Annie watch him right away. That evening at supper, she said nothing about it. Frank was talking about the North Pasture and the price of beef in Billings, and Ruth listened and said the appropriate things and thought about a young man who took his hat off and listened. "Annie was talking to the Henderson hand today," Frank said eventually. "Young fellow Morrison, I think," Ruth said. Frank looked at her. In 28 years, he had learned that Ruth's had approximately 14 different meanings, and this particular one meant she knew something he didn't. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Pass the bread. Frank passed the bread with the expression of a man who knows he is behind on information and is not sure how to catch up. Ruth buttered her bread with the serenity of a woman who has already decided how the story ends and is simply waiting for everyone else to get there. October arrived, and Caleb ran out of reasons to wait. He had spent the summer finding legitimate reasons to be near the Reed property. Fence repairs, cattle questions, returning a tool Henderson had borrowed from Frank years ago that Henderson had no memory of borrowing. Each time he saw Annie, each time the conversation was good. Each time he rode away, more certain and more afraid. In September, Annie had looked at him across the Reed kitchen table. Ruth had invited him for coffee after he helped bring in a section of fence that had come down in a storm, which Ruth had engineered with the precision of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing, and said very simply, "You always find a reason to come by." "The fences," he said. "The fences are fine, Caleb." He looked at his coffee. "Yes," he said. "I always find a reason." She had smiled at him with an expression that was not a question. So, he came in October, hat in hands, $14, and the particular terror of a young man who has decided to do the honest thing regardless of how it lands. Frank answered the door, looked at him, said nothing. "Mr. Reed," Caleb said, "I'd like to speak with you about Annie." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. They sat at the kitchen table. Ruth appeared with coffee that she had clearly already had ready, which meant she had been expecting this, which Caleb found simultaneously comforting and alarming. He said it plainly because he didn't know how to say things any other way. "I care about Annie. I'd like to court her properly with your permission." He looked at the table. "I know I'm too poor for your daughter, Mr. Reed. I don't have land or savings or anything much to offer except that I work hard. I mean, what I say, and I would." He stopped, started again. "I would spend my life making sure she never regretted it." The kitchen was very quiet. Frank Reed looked at this young man, the worn shirt, the hat in the hands, the $14 visible in the complete absence of anything else, and said nothing for long enough that Caleb's heart had time to do several unreasonable things. Then Frank said, "She needs a good man, not a rich one." He paused. "But I'm not giving you my answer today." He looked at Caleb with those fair-weather eyes. "I'm going to give you something first, and we'll see what you do with it." The something Frank gave him was this. The Harlan property, 8 miles north, was the hardest piece of ranching land in the county. Old Jim Harlan had died in August, leaving the operation to his son, who was 19 and had no experience, and was going to lose the entire winter's cattle if he didn't have help. Frank had agreed to send a hand. "You'll spend the winter there," Frank said. "No wages. The boy can't pay. You'll work from October through March and come back in the spring." Caleb looked at him. "And if I do?" he said. "Then we'll talk," Frank said, which was not a yes, which was not a promise, which Caleb understood entirely was the point. He said yes before Frank had finished the sentence. Frank noted this without showing that he noted it. Ruth, who was refilling coffee that didn't need refilling, noted it too, and was considerably less subtle about her expression, which Frank chose not to look at. Annie heard the entire conversation from the hallway. She had not been invited to participate and had participated anyway, silently from 6 feet away. And when Caleb came out, she was standing by the door with an expression that was equal parts worried and proud. "The Harlan place," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "It's hard land. I know. Jim Harlan broke 2 hands, and a foreman in 10 years. I know that too." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said in a voice low enough that Frank couldn't hear from the kitchen, "Come back in the spring." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was simply a direction delivered with the confidence of someone who has already decided how things are going to go and is informing the relevant parties. Caleb put his hat on and walked to his horse and rode north, and Ruth Reed watched him go from the kitchen window and said to no one inches particular. He said yes before Frank finished the sentence. Frank behind her said nothing, but he was watching too. The Harlan property was, as advertised, hard. The land was rocky and exposed, catching every wind that came down from the Canadian border with nothing to slow it. The barn needed work. The cattle were poorly managed. Old Jim had done his best in his last years, but his best had been declining, and young Thomas Harland, 1'9" and earnest and completely overwhelmed, greeted Caleb on the first day with the expression of a drowning man seeing a rope. "I don't know what I'm doing," Thomas said by way of introduction. "That's all right," Caleb said. "I do." What Caleb had not expected was how much Thomas reminded him of himself at 19. Not in circumstance, but in quality. The same willingness to admit what he didn't know. The same determination to learn it. The same understanding that the land didn't care about your feelings, and the only response to that was to pay attention and keep working. He found himself teaching with a patience he didn't know he had. Not because it was required of him, but because Thomas deserved it. Deserved someone who showed up and stayed and didn't make him feel stupid for not knowing things he'd had no one to teach him. By November, Thomas could read weather well enough to move cattle before a storm. By December, he understood the feeding rotation. By January, he was doing half the work without being directed. Caleb wrote to Annie twice. Short letters, practical. She wrote back longer ones describing the Reed Ranch in winter, the snow coming down the mountain. What her mother had said about something that made them both laugh. She was choosing every word, he could tell. Writing the way you write when you want someone to feel the thing you're describing. Not just read it. He read her letters 4 times each. He didn't tell her that. In February, the worst storm of the winter came down from Canada, and Caleb spent 36 hours straight moving cattle, fixing collapsed fence in temperatures that turned breath to ice, keeping Thomas from 3 decisions that would have cost them the herd. When it was over, he sat in the Harlan kitchen, drinking the worst coffee he had ever tasted, and thought, this boy is going to be all right. And then he thought, I want a son like this someday. And then he stopped thinking and went to sleep. Frank Reed did not sit idle that winter. He asked questions, not obviously. Frank Reed did not do anything obviously. But with the deliberate patience of a man conducting an investigation he has not announced. He asked Henderson about Caleb. Henderson said he was the best hand he'd had in 5 years and the only one who fixed things without being asked twice. Frank noted this. He asked Jim Harlan's neighbor, Pete Connell, how the Morrison boy was managing up north. Pete said he'd ridden past the Harlan place in December, and the cattle looked better than they had in 3 years. And the Harlan kid had been out working the fence line in weather that would keep most men inside. Frank noted this too. He said, nothing to Ruth about any of it. Ruth, who had her own sources, already knew everything he had found out and several things he hadn't, and said nothing either because 28 years of marriage had taught her when to speak and when to let a man arrive somewhere on his own. What Frank was doing, though, he would not have described it this way, was building a case. Not against Caleb, but for him. He was assembling the evidence the way he assembled everything, carefully without rushing, making sure the structure would hold. Because Frank Reed understood something that Caleb didn't yet know, that the test was never really about the Harlan property. The test was about what a man does when there is no guarantee. When the answer might be no, when the work is hard and the winter is long and nobody owes him anything. The test was about what he was made of, and Frank, who prided himself on reading men accurately, thought he already knew. But he was going to wait for the spring anyway, because some things need to be completed before they can be confirmed. And because Ruth had told him 3 times already that he was being stubborn, and he had told her 3 times that he was being thorough, and neither of them was entirely wrong. Caleb rode back to the Reed Ranch on the 15th of March. The snow was still on the high peaks, but the valley was showing the first green of spring, and the creek between the Henderson and Reed properties was running full, and clear the way it had run the morning. He'd fixed the fence and met Annie for the first time. He had $14 when he left in October. He had $14 when he came back because the Harlan work had paid nothing, which was the arrangement, and because he had spent the winter keeping himself and Thomas and 60 head of cattle alive rather than accumulating wealth. He was aware of the $14. He rode to the Reed Ranch anyway. Frank was on the porch. It was as if he hadn't moved since October, except that he was wearing a lighter jacket, and the mountains behind him were different colors. Caleb tied his horse at the gate, walked to the porch, stood where he had stood in October. Mr. Reed, he said. Frank looked at him for a long moment. Pete Connell tells me the Harlan cattle came through the winter in better shape than they've been in years, Frank said. Thomas worked hard, Caleb said. He learned fast. Pete also says you fixed the north fence in the February storm. 36 hours. It needed fixing. Frank was quiet for a moment. You still have nothing, he said. Yes, sir, Caleb said. I still have nothing, and you're still here. Yes, sir. Frank Reed looked at this young man, 22 years old, worn from a hard winter, $14 and a horse, standing on his porch in March with the expression of someone who has done what was asked, and is not pretending it was easy, and is not asking for credit, and felt something shift in his chest that he would have described if pressed as satisfaction. Come inside, he said. Ruth has coffee. It was not a yes, but it was the closest Frank Reed came to one before he was ready. The coffee was good. Ruth's coffee was always good, which Caleb had noticed in October, and noticed again now. And he said so, which made Ruth look at him with the expression she had been wearing since the fence conversation in May. The expression of a woman whose conclusions have been confirmed repeatedly, and who was no longer surprised by any of it. They sat at the kitchen table, Frank, Ruth, Caleb, and there was a moment of silence that had several things in it. Then Ruth said, Annie's been corresponding with you. Yes, ma'am, Caleb said. She wrote 6 letters. I wrote 4 back. I didn't know how many was appropriate. Ruth looked at Frank. Frank looked at his coffee. It was appropriate, Ruth said. Another silence. The Harlan boy, Frank said. Thomas. How is he set for next winter? He'll manage, Caleb said. He knows what he's doing now. He might need help with the north fence before October. That section is going to come down again. But the cattle management he has. Frank nodded slowly. You taught him. He learned fast, Caleb said again. You keep saying that, Frank said. That he learned fast. That the cattle came through because Thomas worked hard. He looked at Caleb directly. You don't take credit for things. Caleb looked at the table. It doesn't seem right to. Frank was quiet. For a long time. Long enough that Ruth refilled everyone's coffee with the serenity of a woman who knows exactly how this ends and is simply waiting for the last page to turn. Then Frank said, I built this ranch from nothing. 28 years ago, I had a horse and a saddle and Ruth, and about as much money as you have right now. Caleb looked up. Ruth's father thought I was too poor for her. Frank said, he was right. Technically, I was. He looked at his coffee. He gave me a year to prove otherwise. I spent that year working his land for nothing. He paused. I thought you should know that. The kitchen was very quiet. Ruth was looking at the window with the expression of a woman who has been waiting 28 years for her husband to tell that story to the right person. Caleb Morrison sat at the kitchen table and understood with the specific clarity of a young man receiving information that rearranges everything, that the test had never been Frank's idea at all. It had been the only thing Frank knew how to give. Frank gave his answer that afternoon, not formally. Frank Reed did not do things formally. He gave it the way he gave everything, plainly, without decoration, while doing something else. They were on the porch after lunch, looking at the valley, when Frank said, You'll need to find work for the summer. Henderson will take you back. By fall, you'll have enough saved for a start. Caleb looked at him. The south pasture on this property hasn't been properly grazed in 2 years. Frank continued. A man who knew what he was doing could run 20 head there this season without crowding the main herd. He paused. That man would need to negotiate terms with me. What kind of terms? Caleb asked carefully. Fair ones, Frank said. Caleb understood. He was being given a start, not given. Offered on terms, which was the right way, and he knew it. Yes, sir, he said. I'd like that. Frank nodded once. Then he went inside. Annie appeared from around the side of the house, approximately 40 seconds later, which meant she had been listening from the corner, which Caleb had suspected, and which made him smile in a way he couldn't entirely control. The south pasture, she said. 20 head, he said. She looked at him with the expression she had had at the fence line in May. He told you about his father-in-law, she said. Yes. Mama said he'd tell you when he was ready. She paused. She's been waiting 8 months. He laughed. She laughed. The Montana spring held them both. The mountains, the new grass, the creek running clear between the properties. He wrote her 6 letters that winter. She would tell him years later she had written 6. She had counted. He took her hand, the first time standing in the reed yard in the March sun, and she held it with the complete naturalness of something that has found its place. "I still have $14, he said. "I know," she said. "You'll have more by September. Is that enough time?" he said. She looked at him with Annie Reed's eyes, direct and unafraid and entirely certain. "It's exactly enough time," she said. They were married in September of 1882 on a Saturday in the Millbrook Church. Ruth Reed cried from the front pew, with the unashamed satisfaction of a woman whose conclusions had been correct for 18 months. Frank Reed stood beside her, with the expression of a man who was moved, would prefer not to show it, which everyone could see through immediately, and which Frank was aware of, and had decided to endure with dignity. Caleb wore his good shirt and stood at the altar and watched Annie walk toward him and thought about a fence in May and a porch in October and a Montana winter that had felt at times very long, and understood that every day of it had been entirely worth it. Annie wore a cream dress her mother had made, with her dark hair properly arranged. She walked with the certainty of a woman who has known where she was going for quite some time. They settled on the Reed property that first year, the South Pasture arrangement with Frank, which expanded in the spring to include a partnership that neither of them had formally proposed, but both had understood was coming. Caleb was the kind of man who fixed things without being asked twice. The Reed operation was considerably better managed by the following spring. Frank noticed, said nothing directly, but he began consulting Caleb on decisions in a way that was not quite asking for advice, but was not quite not asking either. Ruth noticed this and said nothing, which took considerable discipline. Their son arrived in June of 1883. They named him Thomas. Ruth looked at Caleb when she heard the name and said nothing, but her expression said everything. Frank said, "Thomas." "After the Harlan boy," Caleb said simply. "He deserved something." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good name." Thomas came into the world with his father's dark curly hair and his mother's direct gaze. And from the first moment, Frank Reed held him, standing in the bedroom doorway, the baby in his arms, looking at this small person who had arrived with the particular authority of someone who intends to be here. Something happened to Frank Reed's face that Ruth had seen only a few times in 28 years. He went soft, not visibly, not dramatically, but Ruth saw it. The specific softening of a man who has been strong for a very long time and is found in the weight of a child in his arms. Something that does not require strength. He held Thomas for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Caleb, who was standing near the window watching him, and said, "Good boy." Caleb understood. He was not talking about Thomas. On a Sunday afternoon that summer, the Reed property was full in the way it had not been full since Annie was small. Frank, on the porch with Thomas on his knee, talking to the baby with the seriousness of a man who has decided this person deserves real conversation. Ruth in the doorway watching with the expression she had worn since May of the previous year. Caleb and Annie in the yard together. The Montana mountains were doing what they always did. The creek was running clear between the properties, and Frank Reed, who had tested a young man with a hard winter and $14 and no promises, sat on his porch with his grandson and was by every measure he knew how to apply, entirely satisfied with how things had turned out. Frank Reed gave Caleb Morrison the hardest winter of his life. No wages, no guarantee, no promise that yes was waiting at the end. Just work, just the test, just the question of what a man does when nobody owes him anything. And Caleb, 22 years old, $14, worn shirt, said yes before Frank finished the sentence. That's the moment that matters. Not the wedding, not the South Pasture deal, not even the spring, when Frank told him about Ruth's father. The moment that mattered was the fraction of a second between the end of Frank's offer and the beginning of Caleb's answer. When a young man with nothing looked at a hard winter, with no guarantee, and said yes anyway, because that is what character looks like before it has anything to prove itself with. Frank Reed knew this. He had lived it himself 28 years ago, on a different piece of land, with a different father-in-law who had given him the same gift. Not the easy, yes, but the chance to show what he was made of. The richest thing Caleb Morrison brought to the Reed family was not what he built in the summer of 1882. It was what he did in the winter, when it was cold and hard and nobody was watching, and there was no reward but the work itself. Ruth had known from May. Frank had known from the moment. Caleb said yes before the sentence was finished. Annie had known from the fence line in spring. Some people, when they show up completely from the very beginning. And the ones who love them, who are paying attention, see it immediately. The rest is just time.